Support for Amanpour comes from our friends at Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans, who are excited to introduce their all-new Rate Shield approval. If you're in the market to buy a home, Rate Shield approval is a real game changer, and here's why. First, Quicken Loans will lock your rate for up to 90 days while you shop. But here's the crucial part. If rates go up, your rate stays the same. But if rates go down, your rate also drops. Either way, you win. It's the kind of thinking you'd expect from America's largest mortgage lender. To get started, go to rocketmortgage.com/Amanpour.
Coming up, are women's rights at risk in America as President Trump prepares to name his choice to cement conservative control of the Supreme Court? My conversation with the prominent conservative columnist Mona Charen, whose controversial new book, Sex Matters, looks at the cost of modern feminism. Also ahead, Truths and Myths, author and Professor Alexander Betts on the great debate of our time, immigration, and what nations must do to ensure sustainable migration for the future. Welcome to the program, everyone. I'm Christiane Amanpour in London. The pendulum of justice is about to swing even further to the right, possibly for decades to come, in the highest court of the United States. President Trump reportedly has narrowed down his Supreme Court shortlist to a top 3 and says he'll soon announce his nominee. With a conservative voice on the Supreme Court, another one, some fear and some hope that Roe v. Wade's landmark ruling on a woman's right to choose could be overturned in the not-too-distant future. To discuss this, I'm joined by a dyed-in-the-wool Reagan conservative columnist Mona Charen. Her new book, Sex Matters, calls for a sexual counter-revolution because she thinks feminism has gone too far, seeing off the nuclear family, for instance. She became very well known this year for daring to call out her own party and president on the issue of values and morals at CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, and I spoke to her from Washington. Mona Charen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So as a real conservative, I want to ask you what you are hoping for, what you expect in terms of naming the next Supreme Court justice.
I'm hoping, as a conservative, for someone who will not be a lawmaker. Over the last several decades, the Supreme Court has taken on far too many lawmaking roles, and that properly belongs to Congress and the president. And so I'd like to see a return to the more traditional and modest role for the court, where it doesn't make policy, but it simply rules on constitutionality and fairness.
So, of course, there are a lot of decisions that could fall into that, a lot of cases, and particularly when it comes to Anthony Kennedy, he was always called a swing vote, but he was very reliably conservative. And he was the one who put over the top Citizens United, you know, the whole idea of money in politics. We have the idea of gay marriage that he sided with. And also, of course, Roe versus Wade. It seems that most conservatives and most people around the United States are concerned about Roe versus Wade. So I'd like to just play you a couple of sound bites, both from the Vice President Mike Pence and from then candidate Donald Trump on the issue of abortion and women's rights in this area.
We appoint strict constructionists to the Supreme Court of the United States, as Donald Trump intends to do. I believe we will see Roe versus Wade consigned to the ash heap of history.
Do you believe in punishment for abortion? Yes or no, as a principle?
The answer is that there has to be some form of punishment.
For the woman?
Yeah, there has to be some form.
So obviously those are two different issues, but first and foremost, do you believe and do you hope that the next Supreme Court does what Mike Pence says, consign Roe versus Wade to the dustbin of history?
Well, I do think that it was a very poor decision, one of the worst to come out of the Supreme Court, sort of comparable to Dred Scott. So I do hope to see it overturned, but please understand what that means. It does not mean a uniform outlawing of abortion around the country or anything like it. It just returns these decisions to 50 state legislators and governors who will make different rules in different states. That's our federal system, and I would like to see it argued out by the people and their elected representatives instead of by 9 unelected lawyers.
do you worry that if this goes back to states, that something like, I don't know, 20 states will immediately overturn it and ban it and make it illegal, which means that those women in those states will have to cross state lines, that it will disproportionately affect poor, maybe minority women. And it's just yet another element of discrimination against some of the most vulnerable.
Well, we look at this very differently. I see the most vulnerable as the unborn children. They really have no voice, and they really have no opportunity to say, look, I really would prefer to be born and adopted than aborted. And I think that would be, if you took a poll of the unborn, I think they would probably be 100% in favor of being born. So I look at it from the point of view of those disadvantaged people. It's hard to be more disadvantaged than you are as a baby in the womb.
Regarding other social and cultural issues, you're a big proponent of marriage, and we'll get to your book in a second. And it has been said that in these troubled times, the gay population have also been big supporters, big proponents of marriage, and they are upholding this, as you see it, endangered institution in American life. So Anthony Kennedy cast the deciding vote that allowed gay marriage to stand. Is that something that you would like to see stand, or do you think in a new conservative court that will be overturned as well?
I'm very skeptical that that will happen, but I would say, look, my attitude is we are conducting a huge social experiment. I hope that marriage does for lesbians and gays what it has done for heterosexuals, that is, make them happier, healthier, wealthier, and more stable. But it's too soon to tell, and the jury is out. And I do think that when it comes to raising children, there are special challenges for same-sex couples that we ought not to sugarcoat, and we ought to be very open about, that you need role models of the other sex in order for kids to develop to their full potential.
What do you make of the current president of the United States, a Republican who calls himself a conservative, having this power to nominate potentially 2, maybe more Supreme Court justices in his time? Because I know that you're not a pro-Trumper.
No, but I am pro-Constitution, and our Constitution gave that power to the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. The courts and the presidency both have way too much power, and that can be fixed by Congress reasserting its privileges. But the president does have the right to nominate. The Senate should vigorously advise and consent, and that's our system. And as a conservative, I revere tradition and the Constitution.
At CPAC, you made a very conscious, bold decision to speak out about what you considered were the betrayals of moral values, of conservatism by the current president, and you were speaking out against what could be termed the hypocrisy of your own party in this regard. Let me just play the soundbite of what propelled you to viral stratospheric fame, and that was what you said to the conservative audience at CPAC not long ago.
I'm disappointed in people on our side for being hypocrites about sexual harassers and abusers of women who are in our party, who are sitting in the White House, who brag about their extramarital affairs, who brag about mistreating women. This is a party that was ready to endorse, the Republican Party endorsed Roy Moore for the Senate in the state of Alabama, even though he was a credibly accused child molester. You cannot claim that you stand for women and put up with that.
So that was brave. I mean, it's really difficult to find people who will challenge their own tribe in this way, and you did it. And you got some boos. Just take me back to that moment and tell me how it felt and what was going on inside. I mean, were you scared? Were you nervous before you did this?
Well, of course I was nervous, but I felt very strongly that this is something that had to be said. And I felt, honestly, that I was speaking for many, many conservatives who and moderates and liberals too, who feel the same way. And that they deplore the direction that the Republican Party is trending. What pushed me over the edge in terms of fury at the CPAC organizers was their invitation to Marion Le Pen, niece of Marine Le Pen, who is a member of the National Front and an apologist for her Nazi sympathizing grandfather. And so I then decided to also mention the hypocrisy about sexual conduct. Look, I mean, part of being a conservative is upholding family values, but really meaning it. And unfortunately, we've seen hypocrisy on both sides about this. Liberals were quick to defend Bill Clinton, even though they had been extremely vocal about sexual harassment before, for example, with Anita Hill. And then they gave him a pass, and then the Republicans now are giving Trump and Roy Moore a pass for similar or even worse behavior. And so, look, if we don't call out our own sides, we will never get past this poisonous partisanship. It really does require people to say, it's easy to point the finger at the other side. It's hard to point the finger at your own side. So I felt like I needed to speak for others who wanted to say these things.
Mona Charen, you have written a new book, Sex Matters, and it has just come out. You take a very interesting look at feminism and how you think feminism have failed not just women, but also American families and the like. Tell me where exactly you stand, because clearly you're not saying that you don't think women should be equal under the law, under employment, under all those issues.
Of course. And I applaud the greater range of choices that women have about how they will conduct their lives. For example, there's no longer really a stigma about women who don't want to have children and families. And I think that's good. Of course, the gains in the workplace, also wonderful. Women's talents are now appreciated more than they once were. At the same time, the feminists made some crucial errors. One of them was by devaluing the importance of family life and family relationships. And we are facing a real crisis. Crisis is an overused word, but of connection. There are so many people in American society who remain single, who have trouble finding spouses. Having children without marriage has now become the norm for high school graduates and especially for high school dropouts. We've created a bit of a caste system in our society where the people who most need the security and support of an intact family and a strong marriage are the ones who are least likely to have it. And they are really struggling. The women's movement has played a role in diminishing the importance of marriage. They thought marriage and argued, I quote them in Sex Matters a lot, that marriage was a trap for women that had been designed by men to keep them down. And I point out, looking at the social science data that we've accumulated over the last 50 years, that women are now less secure, less happy, less fulfilled, and have less rounded lives than they did. And so we need to look carefully at what the decline of families has done, especially to women at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale.
So what would you say then as a final thought on the women who in the 2016 election, Republican women who put Trump over the top? I mean, knowing the very moral turpitude that you identify and knowing all about it and yet going into the voting booth and voting.
Right. Well, that was probably the worst choice in American history. Hillary Clinton was also very morally compromised, and the voters had 25 years of evidence that there was corruption and that she backed policies that they did not like. They were ready for a change. That's often the case after 2 terms of a president with one party. So those are all the reasons. Whether people will vote to re-elect Trump, that's an open question, and we will see.
Mona Charen, you said, what did you just say?
I said I hope not.
Mona Charen, author of Sex Matters, thank you so much indeed.
My pleasure.
Support for Amanpour comes from our friends at Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans. Let's talk about buying a home for a minute. Because of rising interest rates, there's a lot of unpredictability when it comes to buying a home these days. It's causing a lot of anxiety with folks. Well, our friends at Quicken Loans are doing something about that. They're calling it the power buying process. Here's how it works. Quicken Loans will verify your income, assets, and credit in less than 24 hours to give you a verified approval. This gives you the strength of a cash buyer. Then, once you're verified, you qualify for their all-new exclusive Rate Shield approval. First, they'll lock your rate for up to 90 days while you shop. Now here's the best part. If rates go up, your rate stays the same. But if rates go down, your rate also drops. Either way, you win. It's the kind of thinking you'd expect from America's largest mortgage lender. To get started, go to rocketmortgage.com/Amanpour. Rate Shield approval only valid on certain 30-year purchase transactions. Additional conditions or exclusions may apply. Based on Quicken Loans data in comparison to public data records. Equal housing lender, licensed in all 50 states. NMLS ConsumerAccess.org number 3030. When you think of the things you do every day, brushing your teeth probably isn't top of mind. But for something that's so important to your health, it should be. That's why Quip wants to help you brush better. Quip is an electric toothbrush that's a fraction of the cost of bulkier brushes, while still packing just the right amount of vibrations to help clean your teeth. Quip's built-in timer helps you clean for the dentist-recommended 2 minutes with guiding pulses that remind you when to switch sides. Next, Quick subscription plans are for your health, not just for convenience. They deliver new brush heads on a dentist-recommended schedule every 3 months for just $5, including free shipping worldwide. Quip also comes with a mount that suctions right to your mirror and unsticks to use as a cover for hygienic travel wherever you take your teeth. And finally, everyone loves Quip. They were on Oprah's O List, named one of Time's best inventions, and is the first subscription electric toothbrush accepted by the American Dental Association. Plus, they're backed by a network of over 20,000 dentists and hygienists, and hundreds of thousands of happy brushers use Quip every day. Quip starts at just $25. And if you go to getquip.com/Amanpour right now, you'll get your first refill pack free with a Quip electric toothbrush. That's your first refill pack free at getquip.com/Amanpour. Spelled GETQUIP.com/Amanpour. Been putting off buying new glasses? Zenni Optical offers a huge variety of high-quality, stylish frames and state-of-the-art optics, starting at just $6.95. We've got all the great frame styles you want in materials like titanium, carbon fiber, and high-luster acetate. Plus, Zenni offers prescription glasses and sunglasses. So at this great price, you can build your eyewear wardrobe. You can get 10% off your entire order with code 360. So visit Zenni, Zenni, today at zennioptical.com and use code 360.
So immigration, of course, is gripping America and much of the democratic world right now. This Independence Day, to protest migrant family separations, one woman planted herself atop the mother of all refugees, Lady Liberty herself. Here in Europe, illegal border crossings to the EU have plummeted since their peak, and Mediterranean crossings have plummeted too. But that has not stopped the toxic political fear and loathing around migration. Even German Chancellor Angela Merkel, long seen as the refugees' biggest champion, has agreed to migrant transit centers along her country's border. So what's the solution? Alexander Betts of Oxford University's Migration Center has helped launch a sustainable migration framework for governments. And he says, while it is a difficult task, there is a win-win way to resolve this issue for both the desperately needy and for our advanced economies in desperate need of workers. But it does require the political will. Alexander Betts, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
So the last time we spoke was about a year ago at yet another sort of crisis and spike in this refugee and migrant situation. And back then you told me, and you'd written a book, that this is an issue that is fixable. And yet we've seen since Friday more than 200 refugees, migrants die at sea, more than 1,000 this year alone. Babies again washing up on shores, this time the Libya shore. Why isn't it fixed yet?
It's a horrific tragedy. This is not a crisis of numbers. It's a crisis of politics. The numbers of asylum seekers coming to Europe from Africa and elsewhere is actually going down. In 2015, it was about 1.3 million. 2016, 1.2 million. Last year, it had halved to about 650,000, and yet public perception is otherwise. And the reason for that is what's going on amongst the electorate in the democracies of Europe, where migration is becoming the scapegoat issue. And what's driving that is that publics are concerned. They want rule-based approaches to immigration.
Which is logical.
It is, to be able to know who are refugees, who are economic migrants, and to separate the two. And politicians are failing to come up with a plan that's operational to address that very real concern.
Are they deliberately conflating, for their own political reasons, the difference between economic migrants, asylum seekers, refugees?
Absolutely. It's such a muddle. Politicians are trying to say your lives as the electorate are being affected by migrants, when actually it's a scapegoat for a lot of underlying trends. Across Europe, we see the disappearance of low-skilled manufacturing jobs. We see structural economic trends where people feel disenfranchised. They feel that with austerity programs across Europe, their lives are being affected. And the easy option for politicians is to say, this is because of immigration, when it's deeper trends that are going on. And we're failing to come up with narratives on the liberal side of politics, whereas it's the far right, the populists, who are saying, it's the migrants. And that's why the issue is rising in political salience, even as the numbers of asylum seekers come down.
So let's dig into these numbers, because it's an issue of fear versus reality. The figures, as you've alluded to, according to the EU, as of last month, the number of illegal border crossings into the EU is down by 95% from its peak, which was back in October 2015. According to the UN Refugee Agency, 42,000 migrants have crossed the Mediterranean to Europe this year, compared to more than 1 million at peak levels, which were in 2015. So we've addressed why. Now let's look at what's happening. So you've got the most welcoming person in Europe, Angela Merkel, who opened her doors to these people in 2015, forced now by some of the politics you're talking about to do this thing, which I want to get your view on, but to agree to set up control points and camps on her southern border. How dramatic is that? Or is that something she should do?
There's a complete U-turn. August 2015, the German approach was wir schaffen das, we will cope. Merkel told her public, we are a big country, we can cope with large numbers of Syrian refugees. But gradually there's been a backlash domestically.
But they did cope, right?
They coped fairly briefly. Civil society, to its credit, has done an awful lot to integrate Syrian refugees in Germany. But politically, we've seen the rise of Alternative for Deutschland. We've seen far-right politicians being elected for the first time in nearly 70 years in Germany. And that's shocked Europe to its core. Now, Merkel's position in the coalition is under threat. We see in her coalition the CSU towards the right wing end of the coalition.
Worried about AfD at elections
Very
coming
worried.
up, forcing Merkel right.
Forcing Merkel right in order to save her job. And that in a way reflects the unsustainability of the open door policy. Because even as numbers go down, we see a backlash because people are concerned. And what many people want, the middle, the moderate middle, is to be able to distinguish between who are refugees in need of international protection and who are people who are taking advantage of the system. And the challenge is, operationally, it's very hard for Europe's asylum system and those of other countries to distinguish. It requires a way of saying, this is a refugee, this is somebody who's coming for other reasons, aspirational migration, for instance, and then it requires us to know how to equitably distribute refugees across Europe, and there's no agreement on that, and what to do with those who are screened out. And return levels are very low, so the public is losing trust. And some of that is a justifiable loss of trust, and some of it is just unnecessary fear.
You're talking about absolute necessity to distinguish between refugees, asylum seekers and economic migrants. This is what Manfred Weber, who is also CSU politician, deputy leader, and an actual ally of Angela Merkel, this is what he told me about this.
If somebody is an illegal migrant, he has to be refused, he has to be rejected, he has to go back home. If he is a refugee from Syria, then he can be accepted. And I am sure that the people in Europe, when we can guarantee as state that those who are arriving here are real refugees and asylum seekers, are really people who are fleeing from the bombs of Assad from Syria, then a lot of people in the European Union, an overwhelming majority of people, are ready to help those people. So that is what is at stake in the European Union. Not generally the numbers, it's about the separation between the different criteria.
So he's reinforcing what you've been saying, but really the question then is, what next? You've talked about how European countries are not stepping up to take their share in an equitable way. And this has been something Merkel has tried to do for years and years, try to get the EU to deal with this. But it hasn't. So what is the answer? How does one get them to do it?
We've seen last week in Brussels, Europe and the European Union trying to come up with a practical deal that can work. And they actually agreed on very little. What they've got to agree on is that process of how they distinguish refugees from other migrants.
As you study this yourself in your centre at Oxford, and you've written books about all of this, do you have a solution? How does one do this?
We've got to allow people who have a genuine need to claim refuge to claim at different stages. Claim nearer to home, claim in transit countries, not closed detention centres like are often being proposed in Libya and the Australian model in Nauru. They're a disaster from a humanitarian and human rights perspective. But open spaces, consulates, where a claim can be lodged in transit so people don't have to resort to smugglers, don't have to resort to embarking on very dangerous journeys and lose their lives in the Mediterranean. When they get to Europe, we've got to have a sincere commitment by politicians to work together. Yes, it makes sense for the first arrival country, Italy, Greece, to assess a claim, but not for them to take responsibility for all the refugees who come to those territories. There we have to have a commitment to reallocate across Europe. But we don't have to do that on an arbitrary basis. We could ask refugees, where in Europe do you want to go? We could ask countries across Europe, what kinds of refugees do you want? What skill sets do you want? Make allowances for the most vulnerable and preference match.
That's really remarkable. That is a remarkable solution.
And that way, it works with voter preferences across the European Union. It can be sold to the European Union as just. But equally, we've got to manage those people who fall outside the system and say, for those who can be returned humanely, justly, in a way that respects their human rights, we have to follow through on that. But there may be creative, innovative schemes for those who are not recognised as refugees. Could we pool a group of countries who have needs for low and particular skilled areas of labour migration and say, actually, we can give you an opportunity in a third country? So I think out of that, there is a vision, but it requires politicians to listen, politicians to have a commitment and articulate to their electorate a vision rather than following and exploiting the topic opportunistically.
Obviously, one devil's advocate question there is, you might find a lot of countries saying, well, we just want white, highly skilled workers, and all the majority of the people who are coming over are not that.
Yeah. There's a complete paradox here. Many governments need low-skilled and high-skilled labour. In this country, the United Kingdom, for instance, we see with the prospect of Brexit, there's going to be less migration from the rest of Europe, and the retail sector, the construction sector, the hospitality sector, they need workers. Now, refugees, with a real need to be here on humanitarian grounds, can be an asset. They can be economic contributors. They don't have to be a burden. And we have gaps in our labour market. In the longer run, there are concerns about what automation will do. There are concerns in Europe and North America about whether those jobs will still be there. But certainly, there are gaps in the labour market. There are ways in which preferences can be matched.
And I don't know whether you study the United States, but clearly this is a major issue across the U.S. border right now under the Trump administration. And there's a whole load of demagoguery about it, toxic politics about it. Is there a similar solution for the United States? In other words, matching refugees, migrants with economic needs from, let's say, Central and Latin America, Mexico, into the United States?
What's been happening on the US-Mexican border with the detention of minors is shocking, tragic, and absolutely unnecessary. But it shows, as in Europe, that the toxic narratives around migration often have an electoral payoff. They're often something that politicians can benefit from and do benefit from. Now, we've seen examples where the US, with labour migration, has used schemes like circular migration that benefit the US economy and benefit migrants. For instance, with Haiti, in the aftermath of the earthquake, the US, certain states with agricultural needs and worker needs in those sectors, took Haitian employers to come for a period, 6 months, a year. They earned money. They went back to Haiti, and the studies that have been done show that the US economy benefited, the Haitian migrants benefited, and Haiti's economy also benefited. Those schemes can be available for migrants in a way that's sustainable migration, not unsustainable migration that risks political backlash. If you're fleeing cartel violence, if you can't find safety and sanctuary within your own country and you cross a border, you are a refugee. And the US hasn't really grappled with that. They see the southern border as a labour migration issue, an aspirational migration issue. Part of it is a refugee challenge. Part of it is people fleeing violence, people fleeing a desperate lack of their basic rights and having to cross borders. And the US needs to confront that reality, as all civilized countries should do, to recognize who is making a choice and who has no choice and has a human rights-based claim to cross that border.
Really important food for thought. Alexander Betts, thank you so much for joining us. And that is our program for tonight. Thanks for watching and goodbye from London.